Okay, well, good morning and welcome to the Regional Park Botanic Gardens Wayne Roderick Lecture Series for the winter season of 2024-25. Our speaker today is Richard Hayden of the Highline in New York City. He is, since 2022, the Senior Director of Horticulture at the Highline. So probably the person with the most responsibility for what the garden actually looks like and how it performs. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Deputy Director at the Natural History Museum of LA County for a little over 2 years. And before that, he was up here in the Bay Area as the garden director at Gamble Garden for, again, a little over 2 years. And prior to that, he was the head gardener, again, working with Carol Bornstein at the Natural History Museum of LA County for about 5 years. And he's currently serves on the board of the Metro Hort Group, a tri-state New York City-based horticultural not-for-profit. He's also a past president of the Association of Professional Landscape Designers for the Los Angeles District. And prior to his public horticulture career, which really started in 2012. He was a landscape designer in Greater Los Angeles. So basically from the deserts around Palm Springs all the way to the coast in Malibu, Pacific Palisades, Santa Monica, Greater LA. So without further ado, welcome, Richard, and thank you very much for speaking today.
Thank you, Bart. That's a busy resume I have, I think. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I think in the past I have attended these wonderful Wayne Roderick talks and gotten a lot of great information from these wonderful virtuals. And I'll just say from the get-go that California native plants were a big part of the work I was doing at the Natural History Museum, which was a habitat garden that Carol Bornstein was the director of. And we were somewhere around, I think, 60 or 70% natives. And there's quite a few on the Highline, and we're going to learn about those. So let's get started. We're going to do just a little bit of, let's see, we should be advancing. There we go. A little bit of Highline history. The Highline was constructed in 1934 in the middle of the Depression. There was such a need to construct it that they went ahead with a very, very expensive undertaking, and it ran for about 2.5 miles on the west side of Manhattan, bringing all sorts of goods, meats and produce and everything to the warehouses that were on the west side. And the reason they had to build the Highline is because when the trains first came into Manhattan in the mid-1800s, they ran at street level. As you can see here, this is 10th Avenue from the 1920s. And it was really dangerous having a freight train running down the middle of a really busy street. And they had this, there were about 400 people that lost their lives over the course of the time when the trains were running at street level. They had, one strategy was to put these West Side cowboys in front of the trains trying to steer people out of the way. But there was so much public outcry that eventually they built this elevated railway. It ran right through buildings and delivered goods and worked quite well for many, many years. And then, of course, the thing called the highway came along, and trucking was a little bit more efficient. And so the Highline kind of fell out of favor in disuse. You can see its route here, sort of on the top of this picture is the Hudson River. And you can see how it kind of wound its way down the west side. So The last train to run on the High Line was in 1981, and it was a box load of frozen turkeys at Thanksgiving. And then it sat vacant from 1981 until 1999. And during the Giuliani administration, they were considering tearing it down, and they started to tear down a good portion. It was very expensive to tear down. You can imagine the infrastructure that was constructed that would support two giant freight trains side by side. And so there were some community meetings that happened. These two gentlemen, our founders, Josh David and Robbie Hammond, met at a community board meeting discussing what would happen to the High Line. And they had both snuck up on the High Line to see exactly what was up there, because it's 30 feet in the air and you don't really know from street level what's up there. And of course, it was this amazing self-seeded garden. So they decided that they would save the High Line. And fortunately, the new mayor Bloomberg came in, and there was a city commissioner, Amanda Burden, who is one of our board members to this day, who's kind of the third founder of the High Line. She worked very hard to make the High Line happen. And it was a series of synchronous events that really kind of gelled the idea that this could actually happen. And so they started a campaign to ask the public what they wanted. And they had this card printed, and they would go to community board meetings and things like that and hand these cards out. And they received this note back, which I find so fascinating. The idea that it should be untouched, that it should be a wilderness area, but no doubt you will ruin it, so it goes. And this became actually the mantra. And from what I understand, this card was front and center on the bulletin board to kind of guide the way that the High Line was going to be developed. And Robbie and Josh were really smart. They asked Joe Sternfeld, who is a pretty well-known art photographer, to come up on the High Line and spend a year and document what the High Line looked like in its wild, found state. And you can see it's really this incredibly evocative garden, you know, and they would take these giant pictures around to the various community meetings that they were having, and they would put them up in large formats and get people really excited about what the High Line could become. You know, where else can you be up above the street and have these amazing urban views, and then also have this self-seeded landscape? So they had a competition. They invited anybody and everybody to have an idea of what the High Line should become. And this is one of my favorite renderings. Someone suggested it should become a lap pool, because it is sort of a tub, incidentally. It's I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But and then this one, where it was going to be a beach with a wetlands. One of the ideas was also to have it be a 1.5 mile long Ferris wheel. But the good news, from that, they chose 4 design teams to submit ideas. These 4 teams, the one in the upper right you might recognize, Field Operations was chosen. I loved this one. This is kind of this idea that it would be this place to hang out and watch movies. I don't know, Zaha Hadid, you may know, a famous, the late famous Iraqi British architect. I don't know what plantless hellscape this was going to be, but I'm certainly glad it wasn't chosen. And then Field Operations, James Corner Field Operations, Delisca Video and Renfro Architects, and they had the good sense to hire this Dutch nurseryman and landscape designer who wasn't too well known in 2004. He'd just done the Lurie Garden and the Battery Park in New York, but they brought Piet along. And that's the rendering, and that's what it looks like today. So pretty close. And they did a survey. They took a look at everything that was there, and they really thought about how it should be developed and what the design vernacular would be. Here's James Corner kind of looking at the goldenrod and the self-seeded fragmentes, and I think that's sumac behind him, which you'll see more of in a little bit. And they did do a plant survey of what was there originally, and you'll see, believe it or not, 50.9% of the flora was native. And we do have that list, and there's quite a few things that we currently are growing that were on there, like this little blue stem grass. So they used this mantra of keep it simple, keep it wild, keep it quiet, keep it slow. But honestly, what you're looking at is very contaminated because they used lead paint. They train brakes evidently had quite a bit of asbestos involved. And so in order to really work with this and do any sort of planting, it completely had to be stripped down to the girders, all the lead paint remediated, a new concrete deck was poured, and then they added some soil. They put the rails and new timbers back in the beds right where they had been, and then they hired this guy Piet Oudolf to do a design and work with the team. And Pete had some really interesting ideas. You may know that he's kind of the father of the naturalistic garden movement. These are some pictures from his garden in Humelo that I had the good fortune to visit back in August of 23. And it's just spectacular. And Pete really changed the way we think about urban landscape, I think. The idea that a plant is only worth growing if it looks good when it's dead. The idea that there is 4 seasons to the garden, that we shouldn't be cutting our gardens back in November and putting them to bed and waiting till the spring, that we can choose plants that will look great all winter. And so it's kind of like, I call it 12-dimensional chess planting, because he's choosing for color and texture, but he's also choosing for winter structure. And some things don't hold up in the winter, so he's really choosing things that will. We've had a couple of snows on the High Line, and things are really looking pretty spectacular. Lots of grasses, of course, and plant texture is more important in the long run over flower color. And this just gives you an example of the 4 seasons. This is the Northern Spur Preserve. This little spur, you can see how there's a little cutout at the top of the pictures, and that was actually a refrigerated building, and the boxcars would pull right in there and offload frozen goods. So this area does not have a pathway through it, so it made a good spot where we could kind of actually, keep track of what happens over the 4 seasons, as you'll see in this little video. And that's one of the beauties of the Highline, is that there is this constantly evolving, constantly changing idea of what the gardens look like. And Pete was thinking about kind of what he could use for design vernaculars. And I found this quote from when they were just starting to look at the design back in 2004. And he's very much interested in people having an evocative experience as they come to the Highline. He wants them to be reminded of their youth. Chances are many of us have, nature memories, if you will, and he wants to play on those. But the idea that there should be a habitat was really interesting to me, because I'd never heard him talk about that. And obviously, this idea of birth, life, and death of plants being essential to the design, and it being a year-round experience. But also the idea that ecology was going to be part of the Highline. And for that ecology, they chose a design vernacular where they were going to use ecological habitats as kind of a basis for how they would choose the plantings. And the idea would be that it's an episodic experience as you walk I think we're at about 1.7 miles now of pathways. And it would change. You would go from, well, and this is kind of an interesting slide. I found this in an early presentation, and they were really thinking about how the plantings would serve biodiversity. Obviously, if you build it, they will come. If you're putting in the pollinator plants and the thickets for the birds and all of the different habitats, there's not a lot of nature on the west side of Manhattan. And so it's one of the benefits that we're really most proud of on the Highline, is how we can actually increase the ability for our animal friends to find habitat, and for our people visitors to actually have an opportunity to engage with nature. So they chose this idea of ecological habitats, of woodlands, shrub thickets, wetlands, and grasslands kind of being the big 4. And we have some pretty famous woodlands at this point. The Highline just celebrated its first section. This section, this is the Gansevoort Woodlands, opened in 15 years ago. So you're looking at birch trees that, maybe they were a couple years old when they went in. They're 17, maybe 18 years old at this point. They're topping out at somewhere around 30 feet. And I'll tell you a story about that in a second. But, one of the fascinating and incredible things of the Highline is the complexity of the planting. So we have the woodland, we have this kind of cathedral of birches as you walk through the pathway. We have the understory of flowering shrubs, dogwoods and redbuds in this case. And then we have the ground level, where he's using meadow grasses, Virginia bluebells in this picture, ferns, and all sorts of things. And that is a hallmark of all of the Highline plantings, is that there is this layered complexity. And here's just a list of some of the plants that occur in the Gansevoort woodland. Almost all natives, frankly. There are a few exotics. There's Harlequin glorybower, which is an understory flowering plant from Asia, but and then a few of the ground covers, like the Humalo Stakes. But you get a sense of just how evocative this can be at different times of the year. And here's the Humalo Stakes. This is a European, I think, or Eastern European variety. But it has amazing winter structure. You can see those flowers have incredible seed heads that hold up all winter. So it's a great plant for achieving what Piet likes to achieve. I think it's planted here with Pennsylvania sedge. And then, of course, the fall picture in the Gansevoort woodland is amazing. The grasses get very tawny. We get very structural with seed heads. And of course, the birches are very sculptural and evocative when we do get some snow, like we've had a couple times this year. I don't know if you can see, but kind of on the left-hand side, there's a big brown trunk back there, and that is actually a river birch. The white birches are gray birches, Betula populifera. But the river birch, Betula nigra, snuck in as a gray birch. They were very young and they couldn't tell the difference. So it got planted, and then 10 years on, it's the biggest tree in the Highland. It's almost 40 feet tall. And Piet loves that kind of serendipity by design, that there's just this one outlier. And when I first started at the Highland, I was very concerned about all these very tall trees growing in right here. This bed is only 18 inches of soil. And it kept me up at night thinking that things were going to start blowing over, and we do get some hurricanes. But then I was hiking in the Appalachian Trail of Connecticut a couple of years ago, and there had been a windstorm and some mature trees had blown over, and the entire forest was growing in 18 inches of soil above all of the ledge rock. And so I figured out that Mother Nature had an ecology for evolving in 18 inches of soil, and I got a little less worried. And here's the Gansevoort woodland from that picture that we saw previously. Lots of things draping down as well. So another woodland area we have is this area called the Flyover, which is kind of mid-park at 26 to 24th Street. And it was the idea for this kind of elevated canopy walk was determined by the fact that the original self-seeded landscape in this area was the only spot where there were really trees growing. The two buildings you see were existing, so there was kind of this protected canyon here, these sumacs and ailanthus, tree of heaven. So they decided they would create this canopy walk, and Piet was visiting us in October and hadn't been in a couple of years. He could not believe just how, I don't think they had any idea that we would have 30-foot tall trees in this section 15 years later. So this is the beautiful sassafras. If you don't know this, it's a wonderful, this is its bloom period. And then the fall color for this tree is amazing. A lot of natives here as well, a lot of magnolias. And we've added a couple of new things. We've added our native pawpaw, which is a delicious kind of custardy fruit tree. I think is it an avocado or a mango relative that's kind of up north? And then here you can see the fall color for the sassafras. The burgundies and the orange really are spectacular. And there is a wonderful understory that you look down on, a tapestry of ground covers that Piet has created that, it's tremendous amount of work for us to keep the light coming through keeping everything happy. We do a lot of trimming. This year we had the tree trimmers come in. They'll be working actually in this garden next Wednesday. And then the other woodland we have is brand new. It just opened a year ago, and it's brand new construction as well. They decided to link the High Line over to, it's called Manhattan West. It's a big building infrastructure that then you can walk through that building and get to the Moynihan train station. So the idea is that you can go basically from 34th Street in Manhattan all the way down to the West Village at basically 11th Street without ever hitting street level. And this particular section, which is brand new construction, has 4 feet of soil. So we were able to add in some new species that we don't have in the rest of the park, like these red maples that are kind of turning orange. And this is based on a Northeast forest ecology. And so it does have this beautiful kind of fall color. And then the other ecology that kind of mimics a woodland, but it's slightly different, is this idea of the shrub thicket or the woodland edge. And we have this area called the Chelsea thicket, which is indeed very thick and takes a tremendous amount of shaping to keep everything growing together and behaving. But it has this wonderful kind of spring understory as well. Different kinds of red buds and dogwoods and Philadelphus, and the Sambucus canadensis are really nice in this area as well. Lots of birds come in for those fruits. Here you get a real sense of it in the fall. Very thick, very lush, and it gives you a much different feeling than some of the other areas of the park. And it does have birches that repeat here. So there is a design vernacular that kind of repeats along the High Line. So you do get a sense of place, that it's not always some brand new collection of plants. And here's this wonderful Jelena witch hazel, which should be blooming, usually starts sometime in February. And if we get a warm day, the fragrance is amazing. So another thicket that we have is on the Hudson Overlook, and that is a collection of different kinds of sumacs. Rus glabra, typhina, and I think there is also capellina here as well. And this was one of the recalls from the original self-seeded landscape that James Corner wanted to incorporate. No one was really using sumacs ornamentally back in 2009, on this coast anyway. They were the plant that you saw growing along the highway. But they've really, they've come to really capture people's imaginations. It's great texture. The seed heads hold all winter. Yes, it is a management issue because they're constantly pushing thicket growth, but it gives us an opportunity to kind of select for new stalks. They don't live terribly long. And then, of course, the other advantage is this beautiful fall color. Looks great with the asters. And you do see the Hudson from this area, so it's kind of nice to have this more native landscape in this area. We are about, by species count, we're about 60% native. And I think by biomass, we're probably closer to 85% native because most of the trees are native. Here, the Woodland Edge, this is a garden that's just a block long at Little West 12th Street. Has a series of our native chokecherries, witch hazels. And I love the way that Piet has done the ground covers here. He drifts them across the path. So it feels very natural. It feels like the garden was growing and we just kind of placed the path down in the center. It really kind of grounds this in this beautiful kind of textures. And then at the very north end of the park, we have another, what I'm going to call thicket. And this is actually still self-seeded landscape. So from 30th and 11th Avenue all the way up to 34th Street, which is the north end of the High Line. This has not been replanted. It is just the original self-seeded landscape that's occurring there was no soil up here originally, right? This was just what they call ballast rock, which is like a 3/4 inch chert, I think. And it's just the rock that was between the railroad ties and the rails. And of course, soil formed. This is how the High Line got its original self-seeded landscape, is the landscape ties disintegrated, and that made some soil, probably creosote silk soil, but soil. And then, of course, things grew and decayed, and you built a little bit more soil. And so this was originally very, very much of a grassland. And we decided that we wanted to open it to the public, but didn't have the money to really remediate and do everything we'd done in the rest of the park. So they put in what you see on the left-hand side here is an interim walkway, and just the railings to keep people on the path. But the interesting thing, that the extra water that falls on that pathway now sheets off to the side. And so the first 24, 36 inches along the path is getting twice as much water as it used to. And now we have a lot of more shrubs and small trees actually forming. So just that one intervention of putting a pathway in is really kind of changing what's growing up here. Lots of invasives as well. We're dealing with oriental bittersweet and mugwort. And because this soil is contaminated, we really can't pull things because we don't want to create the dusk. So we're limited because we're completely chemical free. So we don't have herbicides that we can call in to help us control some of these things. So it's just a question of continuing to cut and cut and cut. And this is where actually our corporate volunteers come in very handy. We let them loose, and they just knock back everything that we don't want. And hopefully at some point we'll get to a point where we've just zapped all the energy and we can keep the invasives at bay. And then we do have a wetland. We have this, it's the skinny bed on the right side of this picture, next to the water feature, where the water feature just sheets across the pathway. And on a hot summer day in Manhattan, it comes in really handy to get your feet wet, as you can see people doing here. But the idea would be that that whole skinny bed along the edge there under the railing on the right is all natives, and it's a bog planting. And the idea would be that you could squint your eyes and pretend that these plants might have been growing along the edge of the Hudson River. You can get a sense of it here. There was, unfortunately, cattail was put in, typha, and it kind of took over, you can see, and also horsetail, equisetum. And 15 years after they were planted, this bed was nothing but horsetail. So this past spring, we made the decision to remove all of the soil, bring in new soil, which, trust me, when you're 30 feet in the air, was quite an event. This bed also didn't have any irrigation, which baffled me because it is the wetland bed and the bed that needed the most water, but it didn't have irrigation. So we retrofitted in irrigation, new soil and new plants. This picture was from, I think, early June, and we planted in early May, and all of these were from plugs. And it's amazing what you can do, how fast plants grow when they've got consistent moisture and a really rich soil. So we're really happy with this planting. It's once again all natives, and looking forward to seeing what this looks like this year when it's got a year's growth. Some of the plants we're using in this bed. We love our milkweeds on the High Line. Of course, we have five different species of milkweeds supporting our monarch butterflies. And then probably the ecological habitat style we're most noted for are the grasslands and the meadows. It's amazing how familiar Piet was with our Native American prairie and meadow flora, because a lot of those plants had gone to Europe in the 60s and 70s, and they were being used over there a lot more than they were used here. And many cultivars have German names of a lot of our American natives. But you can see the kind of evocative way that you can combine grasses and perennials. And so we have this garden on the left, believe it or not, doesn't exist anymore. There's a high-rise hotel that's been built to the right of this. And during that period, there was a construction shed over this entire garden for 8 years. That's finally just come down. this section will get replanted, but I just wanted to include this because the meadow and grassland vernacular that Piet uses constantly changes along the High Line, and he uses a series of key plants to repeat, but it gives you a real sense of continuity and then also a real sense of there's some new discovery to happen. Like on the right, these beautiful, these are purple milkweed pods, Asclepias purpureus. And I have to assume that he knew what he was doing when he knew that as the milkweeds aged, they would turn this purple bronze color and match perfectly with the echinacea and the Joe Pye weed. It's that kind of level of design, and then of course the textures and the shapes, those really sexy seed pods, just really make for these amazing little pictures that he creates. So one of the most famous grasslands we have is the Chelsea grasslands, which occurs from basically about 18th Street to 21st. And this gives you just a sense of how it changes over the course of the seasons. On the left, probably early April, we do have a pretty significant bulb planting. We do our cutback in March. We'll be starting a little earlier this year because climate's warming earlier and the bulbs are pushing earlier. So we like to get everything cut back before there's too much bulb foliage in the way, so that we're not having to be too detailed. But we do have a nice display of ephemerals in the spring. Probably late spring on the right. I think that's Parthenium. And we have very few of the spear lilies left, which are the Aramis, the orange kind of spears that you see, but it was an iconic plant that Piet used early on. And then a little bit later, probably early summer on the left, and you can see there's a yellow allium that's blooming. He uses plants that are all grassland plants, but he combines them from around the world so that he has successive bloom periods. And native for Piet doesn't really, and for many Europeans, it doesn't mean the same thing as it does here. They were moving plants around for thousands of years. And so what is truly native in the Netherlands or in Germany or in England is sometimes difficult to really know because, obviously in the Roman times and everything was moving. So for him, he feels if a plant is well behaved, and it performs in a way that he needs it to perform, then why wouldn't he use a few of them if he's using them and combining them in an ecological fashion? So a lot of the plants on the left, for instance, are actually from the eastern steppes of Europe. Turkestan, I think, is where the Nadia is from. And so you get plants that are pretty accustomed to lean soils and shallow soils. And then on the right, we're probably in late summer. The monardas are blooming. One of my favorite plants, the Culver's root, which is not going to come to me right now, but I'll come about Veronicastrum. But you can see how just with 3 weeks change, it becomes a significantly different looking garden. And then in the fall, we get this really kind of beautiful look. All of the kind of gold and mustard colored plant is thread-leafed blue star, Amsonia hebrectii, which is an Arkansas native. It's a floodplain native, not very widespread, but beautiful plant for texture. It has blue flowers in the spring, and then it does this incredible fall color. It is a floodplain plant, so it has very tenacious roots, and so when it gets established, we have to be careful. It does seed around a bit, and boy, they are hard to get out if they get too large. And then winter. And I don't know if you can see, but in the distance there's an outline of our bur oak trees. We have 4 oak trees at the southern end of the Chelsea grasslands, and those have gotten to be 30 feet tall. And maybe you noticed that the buildings also got very tall over the course of the 10 years that this section has been open. And that is one of the things that we deal with. We had to replant the entire southern end of this garden to make it a woodland edge, a woodland planting, because there just wasn't enough light to support the grassland. And then over in the Washington grasslands, which is a little further south down this, when you leave the birch woodland at Gansevoort, you enter this little open area, and much different feeling, different kinds of grasses, a lot of echinacea here, and wonderful Eryngium yuccifolium, the rattlesnake master, and it has its name because Native Americans used to break it off and shake it as they went through the prairie to scare off the rattlesnakes. And you can see how the garden has kind of evolved. You know, a lot of what we do is manage the way plants want to grow. Very grassy planting originally when I think these are the cotinus, the smoke bush are very small. And then on the right, you can see things are more mature, but the perennials are getting a good hold. And we're actually adding back in the grasses at this point because the perennials have kind of, if you want to be a successful plant on the highline, you have to have a certain amount of aggression, or maybe I should say enthusiasm. That is our wild petunia in the front there, and it is very aggressive spreader, which is great as long as we get in and manage it. And that's a lot of what we do, is really edit. Really beautiful planting in this area with the liatris, the gay feather, and the this is vintage wine echinacea. It's an introduction that Piet made. It has shorter petals and a much more pronounced seed cone. So you get that beautiful kind of structure also in the winter. And then up at the northern end of the park, there is the wildflower field, which has this beautiful, more shrubby, more grassland, much more of a fall garden, frankly. Here you can see the Amsonia, the threadleaf blue star blooming. This must be a late spring picture. And then this garden in the fall is really spectacular. We have showy goldenrod and 5 or 6 different aster species that give us a really nice contrast. And in the summer, this garden has another big planting of echinacea. So you get a kind of a recall. There's a sense of rhythm, as Piet likes to call it. And then this garden a little bit later when the calamagrostis are really in flower, the goldenrods. Piet had, when he first came to visit in 2022, I had just started in April, and he came for his first visit in 5 years in June of 2022, and we were walking up the High Line, and all of the buildings up at this end were brand new. He had never seen all of these buildings that had been built, and he was just in shock. And so he suggested in the northern end of this picture here that we bring some trees down and try to kind of help scale the buildings and not make them feel so looming. So that's one of the projects we're working on this spring, is to bring, we're going to steal some, there's birches on the right there. There's dawn redwoods. We're going to plant junipers and birches and try to steal a little bit of the landscape from off the High Line to give you just a little bit of a protective feeling, because it is just kind of scary, these 40-story buildings all over the place as you reach this area. Plus, I think it would be nice to have some shade on this big radial bench on the right side. Here's an overview. You can see gardeners and volunteers working on editing, which we do a lot of. That's a big part of our summer work. So as I mentioned, it is a habitat, and we're really proud of the fact that we have quite a bit of wildlife on the High Line, which is hard to believe in the middle of Manhattan. Just to remind you that, you know, we are surrounded by the city. You know, there's streets and buildings and all sorts of things that when you do get wildlife showing up, you're just really kind of amazed that they can navigate their way to find us. But, you know, we've got food sources, we've got nesting sites, and so they show up. In fact, Douglas Tallamy in his in his book, Nature's Best Hope, does this section on the High Line that you see on the right here. I think that's the horticulturalist Rick Dark, actually, in the picture. Doug was touring with Rick and was so excited to see leafcutter bees that you see in the upper right picture here. And then he saw the redbud leaves that had the cutouts that the bees were using to line their nests. And he gives the Highline a great shout out as being, you know, one of those places that serves as a connector between wild places. So we do have a lot of birds, some that use the Highline for nesting, and during the migratory season, we see quite a few unusual warblers. Scarlet tanagers have come through, so that they are finding the Highline. We have a tremendous amount of butterflies because we have, you know, a lot of aster plants, which are great butterfly plants. A lot of monarchs, not as many as evidently there used to be. The buildings are kind of cutting down on the monarch's ability to find us, but between the milkweeds and the nectar plants, we do pretty well. And we were really excited in 2023 to be part of the official New York City Wildflower Project. One institution from each of the 5 boroughs of Manhattan was chosen to nominate a native wildflower to become the official wildflower of New York City, because there wasn't one. And we chose, we were very happy to be chosen and honored, and chose butterfly milkweed. And lo and behold, we won. Maybe it's because we have 6.5 visitors that went by a sign that had a QR code to say vote here. But so we're really excited. This is actually just now working its way through the city council, and it should be becoming the official plan of New York City very shortly. And then we get a tremendous amount of other things that come to visit. This little crab spider on the right, I took that picture with my iPhone. Just amazed that, you know, that level of biodiversity was occurring on the Highline. And we do get a lot of dragonflies because of the nearness of the river, and I think the water feature helps as well. And then native bees. We did a study with the American Museum of Natural History back in 2017. Sarah Kornbluth, their entomologist, came with some graduate students and did surveying over the course of the summer every couple of weeks, and identified 33 species of native bees. I think there are 65 that are known to New York City, so we were pretty happy to be seeing this, and identified a few rather rare bees, a very tiny leafcutter bee that we now have specific habitat. When we cut back, we leave a few stems taller for that specific bee. And you can see we do try to message to our visitors that there are native bees, and that they don't nest in hives the way that European honeybees do. But we are really happy to have some signage on some of these bee hotels. Bee nesting boxes is actually probably a better term. So just a little bit about the way that we take care of the gardens. It's funny, I was just at the Plantorama Symposium at Brooklyn Botanic Garden last Tuesday, which is a one-day symposium that we do here in New York City for the horticulture trade, and the organization Metro Hort that I work with it's next year will be the 30th year they've done this. And there's lots of talk about the language that we use to describe what we do. And one of the terms that came out of one of the talks was ecological land care, and I thought that was pretty descriptive. I had been actually using ecological stewardship, and Edwina von Gaal, who was our keynote speaker, pointed out that stewardship was very empirical. To steward something sounds very much like it's a top-down thing, and obviously when you're dealing with gardens, it's more of a partnership. So I liked her term. And you know, the idea that we would previously call it garden maintenance, I mean, nobody wants to maintain something to what it is, because it's constantly evolving. So maintenance kind of has the wrong kind of frozen in time feeling. And really what we do is we interrupt succession. You know, the term succession, that basically nature is always moving from, if you will, a sparse grassland to a full mature forest. And when you actually garden, when we take care of the land, when we care for the land ecologically, that we're actually kind of choosing a moment in that succession to kind of maintain our gardens at. And Nigel Dunn, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's a professor at the Sheffield School of Landscape in the UK, and really kind of working at the leading edge of ecological planting design. And he makes a differentiation between naturalistic planting design an ecological planting design. And what we have on the Highland is definitely naturalistic, and he is correct. It does require a lot more input to sustain that nature-like appearance. And we'll talk a little bit about all the work we're doing. And I guess the ecological planting design is a little bit more free form. Maybe it's a little bit more like restoration work, where you're letting kind of nature really have a decision and you're not paying too close attention to the way that you're curating. So I don't know how many times I get told by people, oh, do you have staff? It's just so natural looking, it must just grow that way, which is really kind of a compliment, but oh, so not true. It takes a tremendous effort for us to curate the High Line. This is Yuki, our senior manager of horticulture, and she's worked her way up at the High Line all the way from being a seasonal gardener to now being my right hand. And she studied sculpture in her native Japan, which makes her an ideal gardener because she really sees the way the shapes need to combine and the pruning and all of that. So one of the big things I mentioned before is the fact that we do have this complicated series of gardens, and you have woodland, you have the understory, and to keep it all happy takes a tremendous amount of shaping. And so when I started in the summer of 2022, not a lot of work. There were 5 months during COVID that no one was on the High Line doing any maintenance. And it's amazing how quickly a garden can get away with you in that time. So in January of 2023, we have some really wonderful tree shaping crews that came in, and they worked diligently through the woodlands and did a lot of thinning. The other advantage too is that, if things get too dense, they become too much resistance for the wind, and you get more damage. So if we keep things a little bit more open, it helps the wind to flow through. And then in May of 2023, we have this beautiful kind of dappled sun, and we have really seen the ground cover layer has really kind of rebounded from us getting just a little bit more light down there. The other thing that this was new to me, I don't know that we ever did this kind of horticulture care in California, but the idea of the Chelsea chop, and it's called the Chelsea chop because it's something you do that kind of happens around the same time as the Chelsea Flower Show in late May. And a lot of our asters, our Symphyotrichums, want to be very tall. And because maybe they're growing in part sun, not getting as much sun, we don't have the ability to stake anything. So we do a tremendous amount of chopping. In fact, some of the asters in the more shaded areas get chopped 2 or 3 times during the course of the summer. They bloom a little bit later, but they don't flop, and they look fantastic. And we do that with a lot of coreopsis and some of our ironweeds. And then, of course, we have to control the spread of things. And we do deal with a lot of invasives. I mean, just that 5 month period in 2020 when no one was weeding in the spring, it's amazing how quickly things got out of control. And this is Allende. He is the horticulturalist in this section called the Meadow Walk. And he's got a barrel full of beautyberry, which is an invasive that was never planted on the High Line, but beautyberry has berries that birds like, and of course we know how they get spread, and it's tenaciously rooted. So he's ripping that out, but he's also surrounded by one of our probably more aggressive invasives, and that is Korean feathergrass. This is one of Pete's favorite plants. You can see it's a beautiful plume, really evocative, but it is a pernicious reseeder. And so Allende has been on a mission to kind of get this area replanted. And now it looks much more like this, where he's brought back the perennials, the sedums, and the brown-eyed Susans. And then we've started a lot more of our own propagation. We're putting in a propagation hoop house shortly. We found a little space up in the northern section. Real estate in New York on the High Line is really hard to come by. And but we're excited to start collecting seed. We're finding that we've been doing this for 2 years now, and that the things that we're propagating from High Line seed have a tendency to really get established a little faster and have a little bit more vigor. So it could be kind of a more specific ecotype that's developed. We don't know, but happy to see that happen. And we're sharing seeds with other organizations around the city. Our purple milkweed seeds are very popular. That's kind of a not easy plant to come by. We are completely organic and follow sustainable practices. We do have all electric tools, including this electric mulching mower. And yes, there is a lawn on the High Line. I don't have a picture of it, but it was a design element to have just this quiet moment of lawn from all of the kind of busy grasses or busy gardens. And then, of course, it is an area where the public can actually engage and get off of the path of the High Line and sit down. And you understand the lawn when you see the preschool that comes up and they have story time, and it's really getting nice. And we maintain it completely organically, just adding compost, mowing tall, mulching, mowing, and then we have certain rest periods where we do aeration. We do work on healthy soil. We take all of our green waste to some of our community compost partners. We don't really have a facility to compost everything on site, but we transport it 3 or 4 miles to one of our partners, and Earth Matter is one of our partners on Governor's Island, and they make a really nice compost. So we'll drop off green waste and then pick up these big bags of compost. And that's the primary input for fertility. Grasslands, we don't put anything down. They seem to somehow be surviving with atmospheric fertility, and we want to keep them pretty lean. It's more in the woodlands and the shrubs that we're adding in compost. And then we have a really efficient irrigation system. I just, one of the things I did last year was renovate the irrigation controller system, which was $300,000 by the time we're done. We have 5 different controllers and 5 different points of connection along the High Line. All the water has to be pumped to maintain pressure 30 feet in the air. So it's kind of a complicated system, but we installed these amazing moisture sensors. And they give us real-time soil moisture so that we can adjust the schedule for the irrigation and be very exact. And of course, everything can be run from your smartphone now. So people can, we do a baseline for irrigation runs, and it's primarily drip irrigation. And then each horticulturalist can look at the garden, see what it needs, and add a little bit more from their phone. And then that way we're applying just exactly what we need to keep the plants happy. And then, you know, I like to say, if you want to know about resilient plants that you might want to be thinking about for planting as the climate is changing, look to the High Line. We are 30 feet in the air and 18 inches of soil. Hot air is above the root zone and below the root zone in the summer, and cold air is doing the same. So if you can really thrive on the High Line, chances are you're going to be a good example of the kind of plants that you want to be planting as the climate is changing. And we don't capture stormwater, but we have a system where all of the water that falls on the High Line works its way through the soil before it gets to a drain. So we're capturing as much of it as we can before it goes back into the storm drains. And then, of course, there's just the amount of construction. The High Line was originally funded to revitalize the neighborhood, and no question it's done that. It's easy to say that we overdeveloped the neighborhood. It did. There have been accusations of gentrification, but all of Manhattan is gentrifying, and so we're just happy to be able to raise the money to keep responding to the way that the garden is changing and the light is changing. The High Line is completely maintained by, it is a New York City park, but it is 100% funded by Friends of the High Line, which is the nonprofit organization that we all work for. And they raise $20 million a year to support the 160 people that work on the High Line. So it's quite an effort that they do for fundraising. And I'm gonna speed ahead here a little bit. I can see we're coming up on, I think I've got about 5 minutes before I reach the hour. We do a lot of planting. We add 6,000 plants or plus every year just to keep track of things that, perennials don't live forever. Things need to be rethought. This year, Pete gave us some new plants to try that we're really excited about. So it's a big part of what we do.
Richard,
Yes.
just so you know, these lectures can go as long as you want to talk.
Oh,
So
perfect.
uh,
Okay.
don't you don't necessarily have to rush. But I think
Awesome.
right at this point, if I could just
Yeah.
ask you a few questions that have come up.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
when you were talking about drip irrigation, is
Yes.
it a grid system, a point system, or how does it vary, and so on?
It's a grid system. It's emitters generally about 12 inches on center, and I think they're 0.6 gallons per hour. And so, yeah, it's which of course, when you've got tree roots and volunteers weeding, the drip, gets nicked. And so it does take a tremendous amount of fixing, but it's easy to fix. So that's the good news. So it's just a grid system.
Okay, and you mentioned really compost was the only sort of fertilizer you use. Do you do any spot fertilizing of anything that sort of looks like it needs it, or do you just get rid of
So
those plants?
good question. We do add compost. We also have I think it's called Hollytone, which is an acidic fertilizer that's derived from natural humates. So we use that we have 30-foot tall American hollies in one section, and we have quite a few other ilex and acid-loving plants. So we spot fertilize those with an acid fertilizer. But honestly, for the most part, if for instance, we've got some viburnum lentego in the thicket that are just constantly covered in powdery mildew. And previously they were spraying with a product called Vapor Guard, which is a pine resin derived anti-desiccant that they thought was working. But frankly, I'll be honest with you, this year, those viburnums are going away. There's just no reason that we should baby them. We'll choose a plant that's happy. And that's really kind of the philosophy that we have around things that may be a little finicky.
Okay, and again, several more questions. Um,
Okay.
you've addressed drainage a bit, but
Mm.
and the rainwater harvesting that you do. But what sort of drain system? I mean, since it's an elevated planting and you can get lots of rain, how does
Right.
how does it drain?
Well, so imagine it is basically an 18-inch deep concrete tub. And then that tub is covered in a drainage mat. And then there are drains that go down at certain low points that are always located within the planting bed. So if the water falls on the walkway, which has planks, the water falls through, and then it migrates to the side through the soil or through the drain mat over to the drain. And the idea for that was that we would capture as much water and hold as much water in the soil as possible. But obviously we have the advantage of, 30 feet in the air, things are just going to drain. The soil matrix was designed to be pretty fast draining. It's a high sand mix. So we haven't seen any issues with waterlogging.
And I guess those drains go down to the
Stormwater,
storm
storm
drainage
drains.
system.
Yeah, yes.
Are those monitored regularly? I mean, do they clog up ever?
No, not to my experience, no, frankly.
Shocking.
Um, it's yeah, it is. They have cages with a soil, with a soil filter mat around them. And I noticed this when we redid the bog bed this year. And the bog bed actually had the drains are slightly higher so that so that there is a, kind of constant moisture. But the seems like whatever filter fabric they were using is holding it pretty well.
And then in those areas where you have sort of standing water that's below where it drains, do you have like charcoals or other things that keep it from rotting, or how does that work?
No, it's just the drainage mat. The only place that that happens is in the I guess there must be bottom drains in the bog as well. They're just harder to find. So the water, we do get occasional standing water in there from rain, but eventually it all drains. It's just slower.
Okay. And then a couple more questions here. Um, when you're collecting the seeds, are you sowing them in situ, or are those all done as plugs um, in that hoop house that you were talking about?
Well, we don't have the hoop house yet, so but we've been doing it just on exterior flats. So
Mm,
just in plug flats primarily. And
okay.
I will just mention this because I found it so interesting. Um, there was a British landscape contractor designer working at the leading edge of biodiversity and habitat named John Little, and I urge you all to Google him. He was at the High Line visiting on Wednesday, and I'd heard him talk at a conference. He's got the craziest ideas for really creating, biodiversity and habitat-rich gardens. And he's doing propagation in giant sand beds, literally sowing on the sand that's maybe 18 inches deep. And then they're literally just pulling the plant out of the sand, cutting off the top and planting that. They cut the top off to reduce the evapotranspiration. They get a tremendous amount of root growth, and now that works because they're not shipping the plants, right? They're maybe wrapping them and taking them to a job site and planting them within an hour or two. But that's something that we're interested to try, is this idea of just because it eliminates the black plastic pots, right? So we can eliminate, one of the factors that's not so good for the environment.
Yeah, although the other thing that I would say would come into play there would
Mm.
be phytosanitary conditions. I mean,
Yeah,
it's spreading soil-borne pathogens um, by growing things in what unpasteurized media and then moving them around. Doesn't sound like a great idea.
that's a good question. Maybe they have less of those in England. It's
Hmm.
amazing how when I was in Germany and the Netherlands visiting Pete and Pete Gardens, they were doing all this overhead irrigation. That's his style, right? He has these tall kind of stream rotors that he likes to use. And if we used those and everything would just be coated in powdery mildew. And it's because we're have a much higher humidity on the East Coast than they do in most of Europe.
Hmm. Okay, well, and then another question was for some of those really aggressive perennials, do you do you actually dig out part of the root system to keep them more in bounds, or what?
Yes. Yes, mechanical removal. We have a native on this coast, Pygnanthemum mudicum, which is a mountain mint, which is a beautiful plant and great for bees, but it spreads. Calamintha, it's a Eurasian catmint. Tiny little flowers, also very aggressive. The Ruellia that I mentioned earlier, the wild petunia. We have a series of things that can be even the coreopsis. I think coreopsis have been also kind of difficult to control. It's one thing when they're reseeding, we can get them when they're young, but it's the masses that are spreading that we just have to go in and mechanically dig. And it gives us an opportunity to potentially propagate at that point, but chances are if it's too aggressive, we're probably good. And so we could be maybe growing those plants to sell or give away, which we haven't even explored yet. It's kind of hard to sell plants in Manhattan. It's not easy for people to drive up and put plants in their car.
So no big plant sales.
Although, we're looking at a retail strategy and they keep asking about that. And I should circle back with both you and Carol. You have some experience with selling plants, plant sales. So I'll get some advice from you.
Okay, and then there was one question about the specific product or name of what that drainage mat is that's at the
Oh,
bottom of the beds. Do you know?
can't help you, but I can look for it if someone wants to shoot me an email.
Okay, sounds good. And there
We have
are
a,
more questions, but I'll leave those till the end.
okay. Okay, great. We're really close here. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about one of the advantages of being the High Line and being kind of well known, and also having 6.5 million visitors last year, is that it gives us an opportunity to talk about, why nature is important, why it's important to have naturalistic gardens, and talk about sustainability. There we go. Oh, well, my bullet list has disappeared, but we do a lot of programming on the park. This is we have a fellows program. It's basically teen interns that we work with, and we're kind of training up the next generation, hopefully, of professional horticulturalists. And we started again in 2023 our horticulture celebration. And this one, the first year that we started this, I, of course, wanted to do native plants. So we decided to celebrate New York City native plants. We had the idea, and then we thought, well, let's look at our list and check and see what we know. The fortunate thing about New York City, there were a lot of people doing botanical specimens, a lot of smart botanists here. So we have a really good record of what was native or is now native. And lo and behold, we had 160 species out of 540 that were known to have been native or are currently native to one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. So it made for a really interesting story. And of course, we talked about the ecological habitat of these native plants as well. We're really happy with our service berries, for instance, also known as June berries, Amelanchier. Really delicious, by the way. If you can beat the pigeons to them, they're really delicious. And we did a nice native guide, and this is still on the web. If people are interested, they can visit thehighline.org/native plants to see this information. And then last year in 2024, we decided that we would honor Piet Oudolf. It was Piet turned 80 back in October. And we did a wonderful in-person panel discussion with him, which is recorded and is also on the website. I think it's on our YouTube channel, and people should be able to find that if they do a search on the web. But we just highlighted what Piet had really brought to the idea of urban garden design. We have the lower right-hand picture shows we have these big panels that go through one of the buildings. It's about 250 feet long, and we get these beautiful interpretive panels, which gives us a really great place to kind of, highlight some of the things that are going on so people can do a deeper dive into the gardens. And then we have these plant signs that we started. We started with 20. Last year we did 45. Originally, the idea was no signs on the High Line. They wanted it to be very immersive. But we find that these, even with 45, they're not at all they don't take away from the experience of the garden. And they give people that are interested an opportunity to dive a little deeper. So I'm really excited about that. Of course, it takes a tremendous amount of work. We're working right now on our 2025 horticulture celebration, which is going to be on urban ecology. And so we're coming up with our talking points. We'll do more plant signs, and all of that work happens in coordination with our communications team. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that it does take a village of staff and volunteers to make the High Line happen. Here we are doing our cutbacks, which we do in March. I think there's some 150 different volunteers that come in. Many gardens, like at the Lurie Garden in Chicago, they do mulching mowers. they're able to get in because it's big, wide open space. We have so many shrubs, and we have the rail tracks, and we find that really the only way we can do it is with hedge shears and secateurs, and it just takes some time. My team also helps with snow removal. Because we have the garden beds, we aren't able to do, salt as a remedy for ice and snow, and so we have to get out there and mechanically remove the snow. And so all hands on deck every time there's snow in the forecast. And then we do get the opportunity to if all holds true, I'm having Pete come every 2 years. And it's just great to get his eye on things and get some new plant ideas. And he's very, very generous, very, what's the word I want? Demure, if you will. It's so funny when we were in the Highline in October, and he's pretty recognizable at this point. And I think multiple times we were working almost 3 full days on the Highlines, really spending time with each horticulturalist, and people would stop and say, "Oh my gosh, you're Pete." And he would say, "Yes, hello, and so nice to meet you." And then he would say, "Would you like a picture?" And invariably, of course they did, but they didn't want to ask. And so then he would pose for pictures with everybody. And here's some people from my team working in the nicer weather, working with teens. And that's that. That is it.
Okay.
So are there more questions, Bart?
Yes, there are. Let's see. What about mulches?
Mulches. Okay. So, I should talk about that. I should put that back in that's a really good question. Thank you. The Highline initially was completely mulched with 3/4 inch gravel because they felt it was more of a design element. They felt it looked more like a rail track because that's, rail tracks have all of that ballast rock gravel around them. And so the landscape architects thought it was a design element. And that maybe works in some of the grasslands, but it looks really ridiculous in my view in the woodlands. And we'd like to just leave the leaves, of course, but and we're able to do that now. We kind of ignore the gravel, frankly, and just let things accumulate. Pete's thing about the gravel was, he said, my concern is that the gravel doesn't really let the birds get in and scratch and eat the grubs. And we do have, a certain amount of beetle grubs, et cetera, that need to be controlled. So he saw it kind of as this ecological interruption of birds being able to do their aspect of control. And when we've replanted, like when we replanted the oak tree section, I fought for special dispensation to get rid of the gravel. And we found a really probably high input. It's a triple ground mulch that doesn't feel like a traditional landscape mulch. It's very, very fine and breaks down pretty quickly. And so we use that just while plants are growing in. But we prefer to have green mulch or leaf mulch. And in the flyover section with we have a couple big leaf magnolia, big leaves. They don't disintegrate very quickly. So we have to collect those, put them through a shredder, and then put those back in the garden. That's the mulch story.
Okay, thank you. And then you did mention a lot about the different wildlife, and knowing that you came from the background of the Natural History Museum of LA County, where everything is quite kept track of, is there an ongoing inventory that is kept of all wildlife, including the problematic ones like rats?
Oh my gosh, what a good question. Yeah, we have an informal list of wildlife that we kind of keep. But one of the things I wanted to do this year as part of our urban ecology celebration was to maybe have some doctoral students perform some more in-depth research. Like, for instance, I'd be really interested to know if there were bats. There are several large smokestacks that are no longer being used, and those probably are habitat for bats. So I was interested, and evidently there are devices you can put on your smartphone now that will record ultrasonic bat calls and make identifications for you. So bat were one thing. I am interested in doing some more surveying. We do have field mice that are adorable, and they come. I've got adorable video of them coming up in the grasses and eating the little grass seeds. And every time I try to get our communications team to share that on social media, they're like, "Oh no, we're not sharing rodents." And we are a very luxurious rat condominium, frankly. They come up, they live in the High Line, and then they go down to street level at night, and then they come home to their expensive real estate. And of course, we do have bait boxes, which I've been trying to get rid of because we do have raptors. We have red-tailed hawks and a few other raptors. But we've been trying a methane control, which is they pump methane gas into the burrows. But that only works if you can stop up all of the burrow entrances, which is kind of hard because the High Line is pretty porous and they can be under the planks, et cetera. So we don't, we don't have a good, and obviously cats are not a control we want to undertake because we like our birds. So don't have a solution yet, working on it.
Well, I think that there are baits that are not or do not go further in the food chain that you might look into for that. But yeah, rats can be very difficult to control. And that for your plant collection, from a botanic garden standpoint, are you doing any kind of accessioning system? Do you know where all the plants actually originally came from and all that kind of stuff? Or who
What an
supplied
interesting
which
idea.
cultivars?
The short answer is no. We don't. We don't know where they're from. The original plants for the High Line were contract grown from a nursery in Connecticut called the Plant Group. And we just are about to open a new section of the High Line, which is at street level. It's the 18th Street Plaza associated with that luxury hotel. And where Piet did the design and we'll be doing the maintenance. Those plants were all grown from the Plant Group. So chances are, it's funny, I should reach out and see, there's a propagation guy up there and find out where but the interesting thing on that is that the High Line has kind of been responsible for introducing numerous perennials into the trade. The original specs, like Carex pennsylvanica, that was a Rick Dark and Pete find, and it wasn't really much in the trade, and then it was used on the High Line, and people saw it, and now it's requested, and you can find it. So we do have a few of those things that we were kind of responsible for introducing. We do have we're just transitioning from a cartograph system to an Esri system, primarily for woodies, for shrubs and trees we keep track of as individuals. But that system hasn't been operated since COVID, so we're a little behind the 8 ball. And we are doing a plant audit this year, and that is because we're looking to, I'm embarrassed to say that we have the most embarrassing plant list online of any garden anywhere. It's a PDF from 2019 or 2017. It's old, and it's not. I think one of the issues too that we find is that it can be difficult to find, depending on your ability and your. So we're getting a new website next year, and we're right now getting all of our audit information together and writing descriptions and coming up with our categories. So we'll have a beautiful, and also curating photographs so that we'll have if people want to see a really nice plant list, they should visit the Lurie Garden website, which has a beautiful, interactive, searchable great information website.
Hmm. Okay. And
But we
then,
kind of feel that the perennials move around too much to really kind of keep track of.
mhm.
So we know by garden zone what's where, but we're not really, monitoring too much the specifics.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that Carex pennsylvanica in particular as being something that the Highline popularized or really got out there. Um, is that one of the plants that you have one of the panels about and highlighting that fact?
It was, yeah, no, there were 25 uh, plant signs for the native plant celebration, and Carex pennsylvanica was one of them. Yeah.
And then a couple of sort of technical soils questions. Uh,
Ooh, okay.
Given that you mentioned early on that the soil is contaminated, particularly at that one end, do you do ongoing soil testing for contaminants or new contaminants coming in from like all the traffic and so on?
So, okay. In the cultivated areas of the park, it's all uh, constructed, specified soil matrix that was brand new to the park. And we're fine, and they've learned from like how the first section of the park performed, and they altered the soil um, recipe for the second section. So they've kind of learned as they've gone along, and it's been the same soil scientist kind of doing the work. And we have been up until actually, frankly, since I've been there, we haven't done soil testing, and it's one of the things that is in my purview for this year. But we have chemical analysis. I'd love to do a biological analysis and see what's going on biology-wise. We've done some just anecdotal soil samples for biology, and it's pretty rich, pretty good fungal hypha and things like that. The contaminated section would be interesting to look at as well. And the reason they're looking to do some new lighting up at that section, and to trench the lighting in, they have to go through the soil, and they're finding that just the insurance on getting people to work with the contamination is just being cost prohibitive. And also just it's all hazardous material. If you look to get rid of it, it becomes expensive. There was a gentleman by the name of Ed Snodgrass who has a company called Grass Roof Plants. Very early grass roof, sorry, plant, green roof, really early green roof guy, works probably in a gazillion different projects. And he visited the High Line with John Little on Wednesday. And he made an observation, which I didn't understand, Bart, but you might find interesting. Pollution has a certain amount of fertility. The exhaust,
Nitrogen.
so right, so there's there's the Western rail yards. Basically, the north section of the park winds its way around the rail yards that come in from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And there's, tens and tens and tens of idling diesel trains in that area. And he was saying it's probably giving it's, because I said that I'm amazed that the grasslands don't need any inputs. And he said they're getting
They're
some
getting
nitrogen.
it.
Yeah, which I found so interesting.
Hmm. And the other question that you kind of answered there about soil was that you started with or they started with a particular mix and then it has been adjusted over time. Is how much of it is organic? I mean, because organic material here in the West just decomposes so quickly. I know in your winters it doesn't so much, but do you have a lot of subsidence that happens and
It's
then
funny,
you're
we were
adding
just talking, yeah.
humus all the time?
Well, and then you're adding it on top of gravel mulch. So
Mhm.
it's not, that's the other thing that it's hard to top off we're not going to rake the gravel off, put a couple of inches of fresh soil, and then of course we've got so much intense ground cover layer that adding in that soil gets difficult as well, because you don't want to add all of that material around the crowns. The original soil mix, it is all organic. There's nothing inorganic in it. It's a combination of sand, and I can't tell you what kind, but sand, compost, and some sort of a silt soil. But 50% sand, something like that, 60% sand. It's really high. It's really high sand.
Yeah, well, I mean, many of our beds that we do have like 10% or less organic material. And so, I mean, if you're even 50% sand and
It's probably more like
40% organic, it's going to sink pretty quick
yeah, no, it's
or
it's
cook
one of
down.
the so one of the things I've been dealing with is like what does success look like 15 years from now? How do we anticipate? And the soil is a big part of that. Like where the sumacs are, for instance, I think that those could be beds that we just literally have to strip and start again, because it's just a root mass. You can't really get other perennials in there at this point. The soil has really kind of, depleted, and I don't know how you deal with that without just maybe stripping everything out, starting fresh. Other areas, they seem to be holding up pretty well. Maybe it's a question of just slowly adding a half an inch here and there, and we just keep on top of it that way.
Well, with the
Stay tuned.
sumacs, since they're colonial, can't you just
Yeah.
dump stuff on top?
Yeah, I think you could. I think that's probably not a bad, it's just such a root mass under there that getting a second layer of things successfully growing, it's kind of tough.
Hmm. Okay, and then anything you have to say about dealing with the wind?
We So New York City Park says that you have to close if the wind gets above 28 miles per hour. So we have a
Oh,
visitor services team that goes out and measures the wind. And up at 30th Street, that area where I said all of the tall buildings had really surprised Pete, there are, I don't know, 9 or 10 40-story buildings built around that section. And it's a wind tunnel. And we've replanted a couple times now. The original trees weren't happy. There were carpinus and Kentucky coffee trees, and those haven't done well. And then they tried some aspens, thinking, what's growing in lean soils and windy conditions. So the aspens are doing okay. The exciting thing is we're getting some sprouting, and I think those are going to be really secure. The bigger ones they put in have had to be guy wired, and
hmm.
now we're trying one of our native pitch pines, Pinus rigida. We think very little sail to a pine tree. The wind can push right through, hopefully. So, and those will be kind of contorted. It'll have, I think, an interesting feeling. So we've got some of those going in this spring. But keeping the trees trimmed out, and knock on wood, so far so good.
And as far as the trees go again, are there are they regularly evaluated by an
Oh
ISA
yeah.
arborist?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay,
Yep.
I thought so.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have, well, frankly, my ISA certification expired when I moved from California to New York and didn't have a chance to, but I have the training, and I have I think right now, 3 certified arborists on staff. And then we have an arborist that we work with as well. So we're
Mhm.
constantly looking, and in fact, it's funny, our arborist is pretty well known on this coast and has written a book on oaks, and Bill Logan is his name. And Bill is like grandpa tree, basically. He's seen everything, and he's always says, I get so excited when I come to the High Line. You have the most interesting pests and diseases. And I was like, well, that's not really what we want to be known for, but I'm glad it keeps you interested.
Yeah, well, and that sort of ties right into the next question. And that is, have you ever done a BioBlitz or anything like that to sort of capture everything that's there at a given day or week or month?
We are bio-blitzing this year. It's one of the engagements that I've come up with, and we did some last year as well. We use iNaturalist. There is a Highline project, so anything that is entered into iNaturalist on the Highline will automatically load to that particular project. But we are going to be using it with some corporate volunteer groups. It's great. Corporations want to volunteer on the Highline. Of course, I can't have them anywhere near the gardens because, 20 untrained people in the Highline Gardens just doesn't make it. That's why the self-seeded landscape invasive control has come in so handy, because you can't really do much harm up there. But that section is getting a new walkway this year, so it may be closed. So we're pivoting to BioBlitzes. So we'll be leading those with iNaturalist. But it's also whatever you can see from the pathway, right? So we don't want people traipsing. It's kind of interesting that, with 6.5 million visitors, if you listen to my team, all you would hear about is the amount of people that step in the beds. But frankly, when you look at the averages for 6.5 million people, we have very little foot blight. It's kind of amazing. But really getting a good BioBlitz, you probably have to be in the garden beds a bit. So we may have to do some of that with a team, or I'm also going to talk to American Museum of Natural History to see if they have some doctoral students that want to come and do some survey.
Well, and it wasn't the design of the Highline was such to contain people. I mean, there's railings, there's benches, there's all kinds of things. So you shouldn't get as much foot blight as like our garden.
Well, but the original design of the Highline, the first 20 blocks, no, 10, 12 blocks, they anticipated 300,000 annual visitors. And that first year they went to 1.5 million. And now with the entire thing open, in 2019, we had 8.5 million visitors. So they were smart. Like the northern section that opened last frequently has double paths with garden bed in the middle. And so a lot more real estate for a lot less garden, but a lot more real estate for people up in that section. It gets a little tight in some of the sections. The path is only 8 or 9 feet wide. And I always say, if people want to visit, please come in the morning. It's magic between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. It's families commuting, it's joggers, it's kids going to school. And then the big tourist push comes, somewhere between 11 and 5. And then in the evening, it calms down again. It's kind of nice in the evening.
And there are, you mentioned a ground level addition, and are there other additions that are planned? And what
thank
else?
you, actually.
What's on the horizon?
Thank you. That's actually, I can't tease the drawing yet. So 18th Street Plaza will be opening in May, I think April or May. And that's at street level, and it'll be just the horticulture team down there. We're contracting out all the other services. But it will be interesting because the Highline closes. It's only open 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. in the summer, and then 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. in the winter. And the 18th Street Plaza will be open 365, 24/7. So it'll be interesting to see how that does down there with pets and people. But I'm excited to say Piet is designing a brand new garden for us at the 34th Street entrance as part of our new walkway work in that self-seeded landscape. At the very north entrance at 34th Street, we're doing three beds around that entrance will be newly designed and planted. And so I've just been working with Piet on that. We've got a shrub plan and an herbaceous plan, and should have some renderings to show. I just had a meeting about that. So we're excited that there'll be a new garden to kind of get excited about. And and I have to say, it's so interesting because his design style is constantly evolving. So I had to say to him, like, this is really great, Pete, but it doesn't feel like the High Line. Like you need to go back to Pete from, 15 years ago and give us a little bit more of a setup for what people are going to find on the rest of the High Line. But he's got no ego, so it's just very Dutch, very like, okay, you tell me what you think, and then we have a conversation, and when it gets to the herbaceous layer, that's really what he's amazing at. So that'll be probably a year from May. We're hoping May, June that'll be opening.
And that going back to that soil contamination question, just for a couple of other aspects, when you have edibles like the Amelanchier and the pawpaw, are they planted in the areas that are not contaminated, or
yeah, those are completely remediated soils.
Okay.
So yeah,
and
no issues.
And are you doing any bio remediation with plants in the contaminated area?
It's interesting. Somebody raised that. I think John Little raised that when he was visiting, and that's an interesting idea. I know there are some sunflower species that do pretty good remediation, so it could be. I need to send in a soil test and see what we're dealing with. I think that's the first thing, and then find out what makes sense. I mean, right now it's just kind of self-seeded, and we're going to manage. We want to have it feel a little bit like a grassland and a thicket. Left to its own devices, it would be, we've got Bradford pear volunteering, we've got crab apples, we've got multiflora rose up there, which we just occasionally coppice so that it doesn't become an insane mess. But just to cast a little bit of a design eye up there, and just on editing, not on planting.
Okay, and then Kiamara has a question. I will unmute you, Kiamara.
Well, obviously, I need to know, do you inventory for bryophytes when you do your BioBlitz? A lot of great biologists in New York.
We haven't.
Because they do they can do chemical. You can get a lot of chemical information from your bryophytes. What they're sucking in from pollution wise, and etc.
That's a really good idea. Thank you for that idea. I will. I'm sure somebody at AMNH is studying bryophytes. I can get some.
Well, you have the East Coast has some of the best bryologists out of New York. There are Nancy. Forget her last name right this second. I'll give it to Bart. He can send it to you. But you have they do an annual conference, like out here, the West Coast does an annual conference, and we then inventory all the bryophytes of a section. So they do that also in the East Coast once a year, and this lady Nancy runs it. So I'll get you her contact information.
Thank you. That would tell us about air quality. Yeah.
I know that on your original inventory of what was on site, it did include bryophytes and lichens. I saw that on the screen when you showed that.
I was going to say, how did you, if you, that was on, okay. Maybe I should read my slides and I would know more, huh?
Well, again, but that was what was there before anything started. Then let's see. There's still about 3 more questions. Do you worry about light pollution?
So yes. The lighting on the High Line is specifically designed to be from waist level down. We have just a few uplights on a few things just for safety, but most of the railing is unfortunately very high design, and I think it was originally from Europe, and it's been impossible to maintain, but it's all in the railings or below. And the idea would be that we light the walkway for safety, but we want the cityscape to be kind of taking center stage. So we're not doing a lot of uplighting or things like that. Now, what other buildings are doing around the High Line, we can't speak to. But there is a dark sky, turn off your office building lights kind of movement. During migration season, we see a lot of bird strikes, that we're seeing birds flying, which is just heartbreaking. We run a lot of things up to bird rescue when they have a little bit of life still left in them, but and then of course but on the High Line we're cognizant of being careful with the lighting situation.
And that there was a bird strike question and the glass around it, and I noticed that some of the surfaces are glass or glass-like in the design of the High Line. We just put bird dots on all of our windows here at our visitor center because we do get bird strikes. And we do have a lot of hummingbirds around, so the dots are only about 2 inches or so apart in a grid. And we haven't had any that I know of since we've done that. But is there anything like that done for any of the parts that the High Line itself controls?
We only have control of the building that our headquarters is in, which is next to the Whitney Museum. And I believe that glass was bird dotted. We're working on a new expansion potentially. I don't want to break news here, but we're working with the Whitney and the city to the meat packers. The last meat packers in all of Manhattan are next door to us, and they are aging out, and there's not they're moving that off island. I think most of the butchery that's done. So we're going to take over some of that space, which we sorely need with 160 employees. We're looking to get a retail space and hopefully maybe a shared auditorium space with the Whitney Museum. But the thing that we do suffer from, speaking of buildings and glass, is scorch. There are certain times of the year where the sun gets reflected and magnified, and like there's the heuchera section of the woodland edge gets we just know when it's when it's the third week in June, and then suddenly everything just gets crispy. So the only thing we can do for that is figure out if there's some sort of a new plant that's a little bit more scorch resistant.
Well, and as far as that goes, I mean, and light pollution, is that why, or has that really influenced the plant palette? As I noticed even at my house, when I had an exterior light that I could not control that would just be on at night, came on with a light sensor and stayed on. And that because of that one light, the salvias would not bloom. The light finally died, and it can't be replaced, so it's dark now, and the salvia blooms profusely. I'm wondering if there's been any sort of impact, because again, I didn't notice any real salvias in any of your images, and yet they do oftentimes retain quite a good structure and provide a lot for birds.
We do have so there were a lot of meadow sages. What is that? Salvia, the Europeans. I'm blanking on the species.
Bog sage, the bright blue one, uliginosa?
No, not uliginosa.
Sylvestris?
Yes, Sylvestris. Like May Night, all of that series. The Lurie has the famous Salvia River from a lot of those meadow sedges. We have those, but they've kind of been competed out at this point. The other one we have is Azuria, which is a taller salvia that's really popular with Lepidoptera, I think. That's up at and that does quite well. Kind of needs some support. It comes up through some grasses, et cetera. It can be quite tall.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
about it, yeah.
and then pigeons. In your images, we saw no pigeons. I'm sure you got pigeons, don't you?
Well, it's funny, I don't show any pictures of it, but we do three things at the Highline. We do infrastructure reuse, we do horticulture, and we have a public art sculpture program throughout the park, often in the beds, the sculpture plops. And we, up at the north end, there's a plaza called the Plinth Plaza. In the middle of this plaza is a big piece where art gets put. And last year it was a 25-foot tall pink tree, which was kind of interesting with roots and felt like reminiscent of the capillary system of the human structure. And recently it has changed to an art piece called Dinosaur, which is a 20-foot tall gray pigeon. So we have pigeons on the Highline. It's art. No, we have pigeons. We get pigeons. They love the Amelanchier or Juneberry fruit. Yeah, we have pigeons, but not nobody's feeding them. They're not just hanging out on the ground. They're coming in to feed occasionally, and we don't have a lot, frankly, fortunately.
That's nice. Well,
Yeah.
and then I think one final question, I think. And this one gets to bigger issues. Has there been any impact from the Highline's naturalistic, ecological type plantings on the New York City Park Department? Are there efforts to rewild or influence the park system throughout the city?
And we're recording this, so I have to be careful what I say. um, okay, so I'm really fortunate. I'm sitting on West 85th Street, a half a block from Central Park right now. And I was in the park for an hour this morning. I have a dog, and so I spend a lot of time in Central Park. And they are working on sections of that, the rambles. They're doing some rewilding. But at the same time, there has been a push in Manhattan for some reason to do this daffodil planting, right? Like they want to be known for these daffodil sweeps. And I don't know if people know daffodils, but they're virtually useless to wildlife. There isn't a pollinator that really coordinates with the daffodils on this continent. So they could be doing better with some of that. But there are other parks, Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I don't think is a New York City park, but it's a 20-acre park built on the waterfront in Brooklyn underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, similar to the Highline because it's built on concrete piers and there's 18 inches of soil. And they're very biodiverse over there. And Governor's Island, I'm not sure what's a New York City park. I will say this, we are encouraged this year with our urban ecology celebration to be incorporating and inviting our park partners and our park management and commissioners and sustainability people to come and to have conversations. One of the launch events we're planning for our horticulture celebration in May is to invite all the Parks Department and the urban ecology nonprofits working around the city for a big networking event. So hopefully we can get some conversations and share some knowledge and have more going on. There is a section at the very north end of Manhattan called Inwood Park, which has they call it native forest. I'm not sure. I don't think, well, NYBG, the New York Botanic Garden, has a virgin forest. The Thane forest has never been logged, evidently, and that's quite famous for original ecology. But we're working on it, so stay tuned on that.
Okay, sounds good. Anything you want to mention in closing?
No, I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity. This has been I'm as I mentioned before, I'm lost in the hinterland between remembering all the names of my Californian plants that I knew for so long and learning all the ones on this coast. So, um, you know, and then of course they keep changing the name. So it's always lifelong learning, right, when it comes to plants. And it is
Yes, it
completely
is.
different horticulture on this coast, it's that whole idea of perennials, growing and subsiding and cutting back, and it's just not something that really equates to the same as the California ecology. And frankly, that's where my heart lies, on your coast. So I'll just say that.
Well, I would say that a number of our perennials do benefit from being cut back at around the same time, May,
Oh,
June.
really? Okay.
And one of the ones that I've always recommended people cut back at that time are the Zauschnerias or epilobiums, because the flowers are so heavy that particularly the larger selections that many people like to grow, that when they flower, they'll just flop over to the ground because the flowers are so heavy. But if you cut them back or even shear them like you were showing
Kelsey
in
chopped the
June,
epilobiums. Uh-huh.
yeah, in June, then they knit together better and they're a little bit shorter and they don't flop open so much. And then we do cut them back hard in the winter. So, and there are several other things that would benefit too. The taller um, Aster chilensis or Symphotrichum chilense, the taller ones certainly benefit from being cut back mid-season. So, yes, there are some things that are that could be more maintained, like Eastern things, to look more presentable um, in a smaller garden. But yeah, that's one of the lessons that can definitely be applied from the High Line to uh, the West Coast natives, herbaceous natives.
There's a woman, Rebecca McMakin, who was the director at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and now she's got a wonderful TED Talk. If people are interested in ecological gardening, she's got a great TED Talk, McMakin. But she talks about the mullet garden, which is that it's all business in the front and kind of manicured, but in the back, things can be wild, and leaves can accumulate, and it becomes way more ecologically rich. And it's one way we can think about, we're not quite big enough on the High Line to have, messy in the back, but it does make for a more ecologically rich garden when you're able to give things, leaf litter and all of that other good stuff.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think on that note, we'll close. Thank you very much, Richard. It's been a very enjoyable and engaging presentation.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Bart.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully see you out here on the West Coast again at some point.
Let's hope so. You all take care.
All righty.